They say a photograph captures more than just a moment. It holds echoes of things unseen, fragments of what lingers beyond the veil of reality. In 2018, a family in rural Maine claimed to find something chilling in a seemingly innocent birthday photo. A ghostly hand, pale and claw-like, resting on the shoulder of their 7-year-old daughter. There was no one standing behind her. The photo went viral for a week, discussed in forums dedicated to the paranormal, before fading into obscurity like countless other internet curiosities. But what if that was just the beginning? Julia never believed in that kind of nonsense. As a freelance graphic designer living in Portland, she had her feet firmly planted in reality. But life has a funny way of clawing at the edges of your skepticism. It was her friend Leah's 30th birthday. A cozy gathering in a rented cabin nestled deep in the woods of New Hampshire. A dozen friends, laughter, cheap wine, and a roaring fireplace. They posed for photos throughout the night, their smiles bright under the flicker of candles and fairy lights. Julia snapped dozens of shots on her phone, capturing the warmth, the joy, the perfect slices of fleeting happiness. But it was the group photo, taken just before midnight, that would unravel everything. The next morning, hungover and blurry-eyed, Julia scrolled through her gallery. At first glance, it was perfect. Leah in the center, her grin wide and carefree, friends leaning in from both sides. But then Julia's finger froze mid-scroll. There, between Leah and Mark, was a hand, a slender grayish arm with fingers too long, too thin, resting lightly on Leah's shoulder. No one had been standing there. Julia zoomed in. The hand wasn't attached to any body. No shadow indicated an arm hidden behind someone. It was simply there, unnervingly real amidst the candid smiles. A chill crept down her spine. She showed Leah, laughing nervously, expecting a, "Wow, that's creepy." Instead, Leah went pale. She stared at the screen, then touched her shoulder instinctively, as if expecting to feel the phantom fingers pressing down. "That's not funny," Leah whispered. "I'm not joking." They spent the morning trying to rationalize it. A trick of the light? A glitch? A prank? But nothing made sense. Julia even tried editing apps to recreate the effect. It didn't match. The hand was too detailed, with faint veins and brittle nails, like it belonged to someone, or something that wasn't meant to be there. But here's the thing about fear. It doesn't hit all at once. It grows, roots itself in your mind, spreading like mold in the dark corners of your thoughts. By nightfall, Leah was jumpy, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting to see someone, or something, standing just out of sight. That was the last time Julia saw Leah alive, and by the time you reach the end of this story, you'll realize the hand in that photo wasn't the real horror. Feeling that chill creeping in? Hit the like button to shake it off. Subscribe if you're brave enough to hear what comes next. Trust me, it only gets darker from here. And if you're feeling uneasy, type the word "safe" in the comments. They say acknowledging your fear keeps it from following you. Leah was found 3 days later in her apartment. The official report stated she'd died from an accidental fall, head trauma from slipping in her bathroom. But Julia knew better. She'd been the last person Leah had called. The voicemail was short, fragmented by static, as if something was interfering with the signal. Leah's voice, normally vibrant and sarcastic, was reduced to a frantic whisper. "Julia, it's here. I feel it, watching me. I can't. Then silence. No crash, no scream, just an abrupt cutoff, like the phone had been snatched away mid-sentence. Julia attended the funeral in a daze, unable to shake the image of that photo, the hand resting so casually on Leah's shoulder, almost possessively. Guilt gnawed at her, but beneath it was something darker, a whisper of dread that grew louder with each sleepless night. Because Julia started noticing things. At first it was subtle, a shadow in her peripheral vision, vanishing the moment she turned her head. a cold spot in her otherwise warm apartment, the faint creak of floorboards when she was alone. She told herself it was stress, grief, lack of sleep. But then the dreams began. She'd wake up drenched in sweat, heart racing, with no memory of the nightmare, just the lingering sensation of fingers brushing against her skin. One morning, she found faint bruises on her shoulder, shaped like fingerprints. She avoided looking at the photo for weeks, terrified of what she might see. But curiosity is a relentless thing. One night, fueled by a mix of fear and desperation, she opened the gallery on her phone. The photo had changed. The hand was still there, but it was no longer resting on Leah's shoulder. Now, it was closer to the camera, fingers stretched out, as if reaching. Julia's breath hitched. She scrolled through the rest of the photos. In every single one from that night, the hand appeared, sometimes faint, like a shadow barely formed, other times vivid, clawing its way closer with each frame. It wasn't just in the photos from the cabin. It was in pictures she'd taken weeks before. Selfies, street shots, random snapshots. The hand was always there, creeping closer, growing clearer. It was following her. Julia deleted the photos in a panic, thinking it would end there. But the next morning, they were back. The same photos, the same hand. Only now, it wasn't just in the background. In one of them, the fingers brushed against her hair. The terror wasn't just in what she saw. It was in the realization that no one else could. She showed the photos to friends, co-workers. None of them saw the hand, just regular pictures, blurry from motion or dim lighting. They chalked it up to stress, told her to get some rest. But Julia knew. The hand wasn't content with being a silent observer anymore. And by the time you reach the end of this story, you'll understand. Sometimes, what we capture in a photograph isn't trapped within the frame. Sometimes it's just waiting for you to notice it. Julia couldn't sleep. The hand haunted her thoughts. Its image burned into the back of her mind like an afterimage from staring at the sun too long. She deleted the photos again, even reset her phone, but they kept coming back. Sometimes more distorted, other times clearer, sharper, like the thing was growing stronger each time she tried to erase it. Desperation led her down dark rabbit holes on the internet. Forums about cursed objects, haunted photographs, and stories eerily similar to hers. Most were easily debunked hoaxes, but one post caught her eye. It was from 2014, buried deep in an obscure thread. A blurry photo showed a hand strikingly similar to the one in Julia's pictures. Thin, grayish, claw-like fingers creeping into the frame of a family portrait. The user who posted it had left only one comment. "It follows. Don't ignore it." There were no replies. The account had been inactive ever since. Julia's hands trembled as she scrolled through her own photos again. This time, something was different. In one picture, the hand wasn't just reaching, it was gripping. Its fingers wrapped around her shoulder, the faintest impression of pressure visible on her skin, but she didn't remember feeling anything when the photo was taken. That's when the physical signs started. At first, it was just a cold sensation, like icy fingers brushing against her neck. But soon after, bruises appeared. Dark, finger-shaped marks in the same places the hand had been in the photos. Julia wore scarves and long sleeves to hide them, afraid of what people might think. She wasn't even sure if she was losing her mind. Sleep became impossible. Whenever she drifted off, she'd jolt awake, gasping for breath, heart pounding, as if invisible hands had been wrapped around her throat. Mirrors became her enemy. She'd catch glimpses of movement just behind her reflection, shadows that didn't belong to her. One night, unable to bear it any longer, she drove to Leah's apartment, now empty and cold. She sat on the floor, surrounded by the ghost of her friend's absence, scrolling through the cursed photos one last time. But something new had appeared. In the background of one photo, a reflection in the window, a face, pale, hollow-eyed, mouth twisted into something between a grin and a scream. It was staring directly at her. Julia dropped her phone, her heart racing so fast it felt like it might burst. She didn't want to pick it up, but curiosity is cruel. When she finally did, the screen was cracked, but the photo remained. The face was gone. Instead, there was something else. A message, faint and distorted as if written in the static of the pixels. I see you. Julia wasn't alone anymore. Julia stopped leaving her apartment. The outside world felt distant, irrelevant, a fragile illusion that could shatter at any moment. Inside, she felt exposed enough. The walls didn't keep it out. They only echoed her fear. She covered the mirrors first. Every single one. She couldn't bear to see her reflection anymore. Not after that night. Because sometimes, when she passed by without meaning to look, her reflection wouldn't move the same way she did. It lingered, watching. Her phone buzzed constantly, not with calls or texts, but with random notifications. Photos she hadn't taken appeared in her gallery. Grainy, dark images of her sleeping, mouth slightly open, brows furrowed as if in the grip of a nightmare. She lived alone. One night, exhausted and trembling, she tried something different. She set her phone across the room, camera facing her, and hit record. If it was in her head, she'd see nothing. She had to prove it to herself. She fell asleep sitting up, too scared to lie down. The room was dark except for the faint glow of a streetlight outside, casting long, thin shadows across the floor. When she woke, it was 3:07 a.m., the time her phone always seemed to glitch, freeze, or restart on its own. She crawled over to the phone with shaking hands, opened the video, and pressed play. At first, it was just her, breathing heavily in restless sleep. But then, movement. Not from her. A shadow stretched slowly across the floor, but nothing was casting it. It grew longer, closer, until, suddenly, her head snapped upright in the video, eyes wide open, staring directly into the camera. Julia gasped. She didn't remember that. In the recording, her expression remained blank, eyes unblinking, mouth slightly open. But then, something happened that froze the blood in her veins. She lifted her hand, but in the reflection of the dark window behind her, there was another hand, reaching up from behind her shoulder, fingers long, gray and thin, brushing against her neck. She'd felt nothing. She slammed the phone down, heart racing, tears streaming down her face. This wasn't in her head. This was real, and it was getting closer. She needed help. In a last attempt to find answers, Julia reached out to the poster from that 2014 forum, whose chilling photo had started her obsession. She didn't expect a reply, but an hour later, a message appeared. You can't run. You can't hide. It's already inside. That's when she heard it. A soft whisper in the room, though she was alone. I see you. The light bulbs flickered, then went out. The darkness in Julia's apartment felt heavier than it should. Thick, oppressive, like it wasn't just the absence of light, but the presence of something else. Something watching. She fumbled for her phone, hands trembling. The screen flickered as she unlocked it, the glow casting faint shadows across the walls. She opened the camera, not to take a picture, but to use it as a flashlight. That's when she saw it, not through her eyes, but through the screen. Standing in the corner of the room, a figure, impossibly thin, skin stretched tight over sharp bones, its face obscured by shadow. But the hand, the same hand from the photos. Long, gray fingers curling slowly as if savoring the moment. Julia spun around, but the corner was empty. Only when she turned the phone back did she see it was still there. Closer now. Panic surged. She threw the phone across the room and sprinted for the door. Locked. The key refused to turn. The lights flickered back on for a brief second, and in that flash, she saw it. Right behind her in the reflection of the hallway mirror she thought she'd covered. She screamed, wrenching the door open with pure adrenaline and bolting into the night. Cold air hit her face like a slap, but she didn't stop running, not until she collapsed on the pavement blocks away, gasping, heart pounding so hard it drowned out every other sound. Julia didn't go back. She found a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, paid in cash, and stayed there, avoiding mirrors, reflections, anything that could catch an image. She didn't even use her phone, afraid of what might appear. But the thing about fear is, it doesn't need an invitation. It follows. The bruises returned, darker now, almost like burns. And worse, she wasn't alone in her sleep anymore. She'd wake up to faint whispers in languages she didn't understand, icy fingers brushing her skin, shadows that didn't belong to her. Desperate, she contacted a paranormal investigator, a man named Daniel, who'd seen things most people wouldn't believe. She met him in a dingy diner, explaining everything between frantic sips of lukewarm coffee. Daniel listened, nodding, his face unreadable. When she showed him the photos, he didn't flinch. He simply said, "It's an attachment, not a ghost." Not exactly. Something older. It marks you, through images. Julia's stomach twisted. "Can I get rid of it?" Daniel's jaw clenched. "You don't get rid of it. You survive it, if you're lucky." Before leaving, he handed her a small piece of paper with one word scribbled on it. "Anchor. Write this wherever you feel weakest." It's not protection, but it helps. That night, back at the motel, Julia scrawled the word on the bathroom mirror with trembling hands. For the first time in days, she felt a flicker of hope. She crawled into bed, exhausted. When she woke, the word was gone, and written in its place in jagged letters was a new message. "I don't need to follow. I'm already here." Julia stared at the words etched into the mirror, her breath fogging up the glass slightly, as if the message itself was alive, breathing with her. "I don't need to follow. I'm already here." She stumbled back, heart hammering in her chest. The room felt smaller, suffocating. Every shadow seemed to stretch and shift, curling toward her like dark fingers eager to grasp. The flimsy motel walls provided no comfort, no protection. She grabbed her bag and bolted. No plan, no destination, just the primal need to escape. She drove for hours, out of the city, down unfamiliar roads, until the sun began to rise, casting long, blood-orange streaks across the sky. Exhausted and running on fear, she pulled over at an old, abandoned rest stop. Half its windows shattered, paint peeling from rusted signs, but it felt empty. Safe, maybe. She huddled in her car, gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing tethering her to reality. That's when her phone lit up on the passenger seat. No ringtone, no vibration. Just lit. A single notification. New photo saved to gallery. Her throat went dry. She hadn't taken any photos. With trembling fingers, she picked up the phone, heart racing faster with every second. She opened the gallery, scrolling past the cursed images she'd seen 100 times before, until she found the new one. It was a photo of her, taken from outside the car. She gasped, dropping the phone as if it had burned her. She spun around, scanning the empty parking lot. No one. Nothing but broken asphalt and the distant sound of wind rustling through dead trees. But she felt it, watching, always watching. Julia couldn't live like this. She needed answers, real answers, not cryptic notes or half-baked warnings from strangers on the internet. She dug through her contacts and found Daniel's number. It rang twice before he answered, his voice groggy but alert. "I need your help," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's getting worse." There was a long pause. Then Daniel sighed. "I figured it would." He gave her an address, an old farmhouse outside a forgotten town, where he said he could help her sever the connection. But he warned her, "It'll fight back. It doesn't like being noticed." The more afraid you are, the stronger it gets. Julia drove straight there, barely stopping. The farmhouse was a decaying relic, its windows dark, roof sagging under the weight of time and neglect. Daniel was waiting inside, surrounded by strange symbols carved into the walls, candles flickering with an eerie, unnatural glow. "This isn't a ghost," he said as she stepped inside. "It's something older, something that wears your fear like a mask." Julia didn't care what it was. She just wanted it gone. Daniel began a ritual, chanting in a language she didn't recognize, his voice steady even as the room grew colder. Julia felt it too, a shift in the air, like the pressure before a storm. Shadows crept along the walls, defying the flickering candlelight. Then, the candles blew out, all at once. Silence, then a whisper, so close it felt like it came from inside her head. "You can't erase me." The room erupted in chaos. Furniture toppled, glass shattered, and Daniel was thrown across the room, hitting the wall with a sickening thud. Julia screamed, clutching her head as an unbearable pressure built behind her eyes. In that moment, she remembered his words. It doesn't like being noticed. So she did the one thing she hadn't tried. She faced it. She opened her eyes wide, staring directly into the darkest corner of the room. "I see you," she whispered, her voice trembling but defiant. The pressure eased, just for a second, then everything went black. If you've made it this far, hit the like button to keep the darkness at bay. Subscribe to see what happens next, because Julia's fight isn't over yet. And if you're starting to feel that creeping dread, type "safe" in the comments. It might be the only thing keeping you connected to the light. Darkness swallowed Julia whole. But it wasn't just the absence of light. It was heavier, thicker, like drowning in ink. She couldn't feel her body, couldn't hear her own heartbeat. Only one thing remained, the whisper, "I see you," over and over. The voice slithered through her mind like cold fingers brushing against her skull. But it wasn't just hearing it. She felt it, like something was burrowing into her thoughts, rooting itself deep inside. Then, light. Blinding, sharp, slicing through the blackness like a knife. Julia gasped, her eyes snapping open as if breaking through the surface of deep water. She was back in the farmhouse, sprawled on the dusty wooden floor. The candles had reignited on their own, flickering wildly, casting distorted shadows across the room. But something was wrong. Daniel lay motionless against the wall, his eyes wide open, staring, but not seeing. His mouth was slightly agape, frozen mid-scream, though no sound escaped. Julia crawled toward him, her heart pounding, shaking him desperately. No response. She glanced around the room, her breath ragged. The shadows were moving, not from the flickering candles, but on their own, shifting, crawling like living things. She realized with chilling clarity, it wasn't gone, it was inside her. Her reflection confirmed it. Julia caught a glimpse in a shard of broken glass on the floor. It was her face, but not entirely. Her eyes were darker, hollow, like something was staring out from behind them. For a fleeting second, her reflection smiled when she wasn't. She stumbled back, horror constricting her chest. Desperate, she grabbed Daniel's bag, rifling through strange artifacts, symbols, and notes. Among the chaos, she found a small journal filled with frantic scrawls and warnings. One page stood out, marked with dark stains that looked suspiciously like dried blood. The entity attaches through recognition. The more you notice it, the stronger the bond becomes. Do not engage. Do not acknowledge. But if the connection is made, there's only one way to sever it. The rest of the page was ripped. Julia's heart sank. She slammed the journal shut, her hands trembling. The whispers grew louder now, not just in her head but echoing around the room. Words she couldn't understand mixed with her own name. "Julia, Julia, I see you." She knew she couldn't stay. She needed to get out before whatever this was completely consumed her. But as she reached for the door, her phone buzzed. New photo saved to gallery. Her fingers hovered over the screen, dread coiling in her stomach. She shouldn't look. She knew she shouldn't, but she did. The photo was of her, not in the farmhouse, not now. It was her sitting in her car, hours earlier, staring blankly ahead, the shadowy outline of a figure sitting in the passenger seat. It had no face, just darkness where features should be. Her phone slipped from her hands, hitting the floor with a soft thud, because in that moment Julia realized something terrifying. She never drove here alone. Julia stared at the cracked phone screen, her reflection distorted in the shattered glass. Two faces overlapping. Hers and something else. The photo burned into her mind. That shadowy figure sitting beside her in the car, as if it had been there the entire time. A silent passenger, a dark hitchhiker clinging to her reality. She scrambled to her feet, heart pounding like a war drum in her chest. Daniel was still lifeless, his empty eyes a grim reminder that she couldn't rely on anyone else. This was her fight now. The farmhouse groaned around her, the wooden walls creaking as if something was breathing inside them. The shadows stretched longer, darker, defying the flickering candlelight. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, weaving through the air like invisible threads pulling at her sanity. You brought me here. You see me. Now I'm part of you. Julia gritted her teeth, trying to drown out the voices. But they weren't just in her head anymore. She could feel them, slithering beneath her skin, coiling around her thoughts, tightening with every heartbeat. Then she saw it. A mirror. Cracked, dusty, but still reflecting enough to make her blood run cold. Her reflection wasn't mirroring her movements. She turned her head slowly to the right. The reflection didn't move. It just stared. And then it smiled. Not a human smile. Too wide, too many teeth. Julia screamed, hurling a nearby chair at the mirror, shattering it into 1,000 jagged pieces. But it didn't matter. The image was burned into her mind. She couldn't unsee it. Desperate, she grabbed Daniel's journal again, flipping through pages filled with frantic scribbles, symbols, and cryptic notes. Her eyes landed on a page near the back, one she hadn't noticed before. To sever the bond, you must confront the origin, where it first found you, where you first saw it. Julia's heart sank. The photo. The cursed photo from Leah's birthday party. The one where it all began. She knew what she had to do. Clutching her phone like a weapon, she opened the gallery, scrolling back to the original image. There it was, Leah's bright smile frozen in time, and that pale, claw-like hand resting on her shoulder. But something had changed. The hand wasn't just resting anymore. It was pointing directly at Julia. A cold, invisible force slammed into her, knocking the breath from her lungs. She hit the floor hard, the phone skittering out of reach. The temperature dropped instantly, her breath visible in the air as the room filled with a suffocating darkness. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw movement, shadows shifting, pulling together, taking shape. A figure emerged, not entirely human. Long, twisted limbs, a face like melting wax, features distorted, eyes hollow, mouth stretching unnaturally wide. It stepped closer. Julia tried to crawl away, but her body felt heavy, pinned down by fear itself. The figure knelt beside her, its face inches from hers. No breath, no warmth, just an endless abyssal darkness staring back. Then it spoke. "Thank you for seeing me." Everything went black. Julia awoke with a gasp, her lungs desperate for air, as if she'd been drowning in darkness. She was no longer in the farmhouse. She was back in her apartment, but it wasn't the same. The lights flickered dimly, casting long, unnatural shadows that didn't quite align with the furniture. The familiar smell of old coffee and dust was gone, replaced by something metallic, sharp, like the scent of blood. Her walls were bare, the windows dark as if the world outside had vanished. Her phone lay beside her, screen cracked but still faintly glowing. One notification. New photo saved to gallery. She hesitated, her fingers trembling as she reached for it. She knew she shouldn't look. But curiosity, the very thing that had started all this, was stronger than fear. She opened the gallery. It was a photo of her sleeping, but not just her. The figure was there, crouched beside her bed, its face inches from hers. Hollow eyes, a smile that didn't belong on any human face. And its hand, those long gray fingers, rested gently on her chest, right where she now felt a cold, heavy pressure. Julia's scream was trapped in her throat. She scrambled out of bed, the room spinning around her. The walls seemed to breathe, pulsing with an invisible life. Every reflection, windows, picture frames, even the gleam of her phone screen, showed not just her, but it, always there, watching. She grabbed Daniel's journal from her bag, flipping through the pages with frantic desperation. There had to be something she missed. A clue, a way out. Near the very back, scribbled hastily in shaky handwriting, "It thrives on attention. The more you fear it, the stronger it gets. To weaken it, forget, ignore, deny its existence." Julia's mind raced. Every time she acknowledged it, looked at it, thought about it, it grew stronger. That's why the photos wouldn't stop. It wasn't just haunting her. It was feeding on her fear. She stood in front of the cracked bathroom mirror, staring at her own reflection. But she wasn't alone. The figure stood behind her, its hand resting lightly on her shoulder. Her heart pounded, but she clenched her fists, forcing herself to breathe. "I don't see you," she whispered, her voice shaking. The reflection didn't move. She said it again, louder this time. "I don't see you." A sharp, guttural sound echoed through the room, a distorted screech of frustration. The figure's face twisted, mouth stretching impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged black teeth. But Julia didn't flinch. "I don't see you." The lights flickered violently. The walls shook, but she kept repeating it over and over, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I don't see you. I don't see you. I don't see you!" With a final ear-splitting scream, the figure dissolved into shadows, fading into the cracks of the walls, the floor, the very air itself. The pressure lifted. The apartment grew silent. Julia collapsed to the floor, trembling, but alive. She grabbed her phone, opened the gallery. The photos were gone, all of them. But just as relief washed over her, one final notification appeared. "New photo saved to gallery." Her blood turned to ice. She opened it. A blank black image, except for one thing. A message, faintly glowing in the darkness. "You can't forget me." Julia stared at the screen, her breath shallow, fingers tightening around the phone until her knuckles turned white. "You can't forget me." The words seemed to pulse, flickering faintly like they were alive, embedded deep within the device. No, deeper than that. Embedded in her mind. She threw the phone across the room, shattering it against the wall. The screen cracked, pieces splintering onto the floor. But the glow, the faint, sinister glow remained, even without power. This wasn't just in the photos anymore. It was in her. She curled into herself on the floor, rocking back and forth, trying to steady her breath. Daniel's warning echoed in her mind. It thrives on attention. But how could she ignore something that had burrowed itself into every corner of her life? Her mind, her memories. That's when she realized. Maybe she couldn't. But what if she didn't have to ignore it? What if she confronted it? Not just with fear, but with understanding. What if the power it held over her wasn't because she saw it, but because she feared it? Julia picked herself up, blood pounding in her ears, and stared into the cracked mirror once again. The reflection was there, as always. Her face, hollow and exhausted. But behind her, in the fractured shards, the figure lurked. Its twisted grin stretched impossibly wide, its hollow eyes drinking in her fear. But she didn't look away this time. She stepped closer. "I see you," she whispered, "and I'm not afraid of you anymore." The figure's grin faltered. She felt a shift in the air, a ripple of tension snapping like an invisible thread. "You're not real," Julia continued, her voice growing stronger. "You're just a shadow, a parasite, and I'm done feeding you." The lights flickered violently. The walls trembled as if the very room was trying to reject her words. But she didn't stop. "You don't control me. You never did." The figure lunged, its distorted form breaking through the reflection like shattered glass exploding outward. Julia braced herself, expecting cold fingers to wrap around her throat, but nothing touched her. She opened her eyes. The figure was gone. The mirror was just a mirror again. She exhaled shakily, her heart racing not from fear, but from relief. Was it over? She didn't know. But for the first time in months, the apartment felt empty in the best way possible. She cleaned up the shattered phone, the broken glass, the remnants of fear. Days passed, then weeks. No photos, no whispers, no shadows creeping just out of sight. Life crept back in slowly, like light seeping through the cracks after a long night. But one evening, as Julia was settling in with a cup of tea, her new phone buzzed. New photo saved to gallery. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from anticipation. She opened the gallery. It was a photo of her reflection in the mirror. But this time she was alone, except for one detail. In the corner of the photo, faint and barely visible, written in smudged gray letters, "Did you forget me?" Julia stared at the photo, her pulse quickening, not with fear this time, but with something sharper, a simmering defiance. Did you forget me? No, she hadn't, but she'd hoped it had forgotten her. The message wasn't just words. It was a provocation, a baited hook cast into the fragile calm she'd painstakingly rebuilt. Her apartment, once a fragile sanctuary, now felt like a glass box, brittle and transparent. She could feel it again, that faint pressure, like invisible eyes pressing against her skin, waiting for her to react. But she didn't flinch, not this time. She studied the photo closely. It was her reflection, yes, but something was different. The lighting was off, shadows falling where they shouldn't, and in the corner, where the message was scrawled, there was something else, a shape, small, faint, almost unnoticeable unless you were looking for it. A handprint, but not hers. Her breath hitched. The handprint wasn't on the mirror in the photo, it was on the other side, as if someone or something had left it from within the reflection itself. Julia's mind raced. This wasn't random. It was a message, yes, but also a clue. She remembered Daniel's words, "You survive it by understanding it." Maybe she'd been fighting the wrong battle all along. This wasn't about fear. It wasn't even about her. It was about connection. A thread woven through moments, memories, images. That's why it used photos. Not just to haunt her, but to anchor itself. And if it needed that connection to exist, she could sever it, not by ignoring it, but by confronting its origin. Julia dug through her old files, cloud backups, even her discarded phone. She found the original photo, the one from Leah's birthday party. The first photo, the starting point. Her fingers hovered over the delete button, but then she hesitated. What if that wasn't enough? What if deleting it only buried the connection deeper? No, she needed to face it fully, to unmake the moment it was born. She printed the photo, held it in trembling hands, stared at it, not with fear, but with intent. Then she burned it. The flames curled the edges, darkening Leah's smiling face, consuming the ghostly hand, turning the image to ash. For a brief moment, Julia felt nothing. No shift, no release, just emptiness. But then her phone buzzed. New photo saved to gallery. Heart pounding, she opened it. It was a photo of the ashes, but the message was clear, burned faintly into the remnants. You can't erase what's part of you. Her blood ran cold, because deep down she knew. It was never in the photo. It was always in her. Julia sat in the dim glow of her apartment, the faint light flickering like it too was afraid. The photo on her phone, the one of the ashes, still stared back at her. The message burned into her mind. You can't erase what's part of you. She wanted to believe it was lying, that this was just another trick, another attempt to feed on her fear. But deep down, She knew this wasn't something she could delete, burn, or run from. It wasn't in the photo anymore. It had never just been in the photo. It was in her, and it always had been. She thought back to before the photo, before Leah's birthday party, the restless nights, the cold spots in her apartment, the feeling of being watched long before there was any proof. Maybe that first photo hadn't captured it. Maybe it had simply revealed it. The thought settled over her like a heavy blanket. There was no ritual, no exorcism, no last-minute escape. This was her reality now. But that didn't mean she was powerless. If it thrived on fear, on acknowledgement, on attention, what if she starved it? What if she treated it like what it truly was, just a shadow without a light to cast it? Julia stood up, her body trembling but fueled by something stronger than fear, determination. She walked to the bathroom mirror, the place where she'd seen it the clearest. Her reflection stared back at her, hollow-eyed and exhausted, but alive. She waited, and there it was, the faint outline behind her, like a smudge on the glass, its shape barely distinguishable but undeniably there. Her heart raced, but she didn't let it win. She didn't scream. She didn't flinch. She smiled, not out of joy but defiance. "I see you," she whispered, "and I don't care." The shadow twitched, its form distorting like smoke caught in a sudden gust. The lights flickered violently, the apartment shaking as if reality itself was resisting her words. But she stood her ground. "You're nothing without me," she continued, her voice steady. "You're just nothing." The figure let out a sound, not a scream, but something worse, a distortion, like static mixed with the distant echo of something ancient and angry. The lights went out. Silence. Julia didn't move, didn't blink. She stood there, breathing steadily, refusing to give it the reaction it wanted. And slowly, the pressure lifted. The room grew still. She turned away from the mirror, walked to her phone and opened the gallery one last time. No new photos, just emptiness. Weeks passed, then months. No whispers, no shadows, no signs. She wasn't sure if it was gone or if she'd simply stopped noticing, but maybe that was the point. It only existed if she let it, and she wouldn't, ever again.